Listen, I know he was German. I know he was mean. I know whatever you want to say. But for that moment, that man decided to let me go with my mother. You can say he was kind. You can say he may have been a father. You can be cynical and say, listen, they'll kill her in the next camp. They're not going to let a child go in there. But bottom line is, I went with my mother.
Many people remember the Girl in Red sequence from Schindler's List, where a young girl in the Krakòw Ghetto is seen running amongst the pandemonium as the ghetto is cleared out. My Aunt Dottie was 6 years old, about the same age as this young girl when she was moved from Krakow to a camp through the cattle car system. Similarly to how this young girl has to hide in the movie, my aunt lived and hid in a box for part of her childhood. Later in the movie, the girl in red is dead in a pile of bodies. Unlike this fictional girl, and unlike millions of other real ones, my aunt was lucky enough to survive. In this interview, Dorothy Berman recounts her experiences as a child in the Holocaust. Unfortunately, or some would say fortunately, she suffers from amnesia and cannot remember anything about what happened to her before she came to America, her first ever memory being from the boat on the way over. Thus, the stories she tells are all stories her parents told her. So this is my Aunt Dottie. Can you tell me a little bit about your childhood and what you remember of it?
Right. My conversations with my parents were really to give me some memory. I literally have no memory of what happened in Europe. It's as if I came to America and my life started here. It's very unusual to have a child almost 10 years old and have no memory. We came here in 1947. I can talk about my first school. I remember all that. But what happened to me in Europe is only what I was told by my parents, mostly near the end of their life, actually. They told me very little when I was growing up. The only thing they told me was, and I guess it was, like many parents, they want their children to do well in school, because in our high school, they had an essay contest, and whoever won a whole $100. When I went to high school, that was a lot of money. And that essay was something that my parents told me. It was called The Cat That Saved My Life. During the war, when I started telling you stories, I was kept in a box, literally, while my mother worked near the end of the war. But I'll go back to the beginning. We were trying to leave. We never made it out. We were caught and put into the ghetto in Krakow. The Krakòw Ghetto has good history for the simple reason that Schindler's List takes place in the Krakòw Ghetto. I saw that movie 3 times because I thought something maybe will hit my memory. My father says the guy in it who keeps shooting Jews from the terrace of his house, that was exactly true. People were afraid to walk anywhere near his home because he would take out a gun and just start shooting at people below on the street. And he did have a Jewish woman that he kept there in his home that people knew about. But I'll go back to the ghetto. I was a really young child at that point, a baby. So we were stuck in the ghetto, and my mother set herself up, and I have no idea how. She was the most resourceful person I knew. She made something that we hardly wear. Now we wear Spanx. In those days, they were called girdles for the German wives and for the Polish wives of the officers who were working with the Germans. My father, whatever you need, he decided he could do. He convinced them he was a tailor. He was a tailor like I'm a ballerina. He had no idea how to tailor anything. My mother told me that she was able to walk around Krakow to deliver what she made. And that way she was able to get me extra food on the black market. So then the ghetto was emptied, just like it says in Schindler's List, and people were sent to Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. What happened was, just like in Schindler's List, where he got a group of workers to go to his factory, the Germans who didn't leave the ghetto when it was emptied and could still stay in Krakow kept their workers. So my father was kept in his shop, and the officer who was the head of that shop was convinced by my father that my mother should be brought to the shop because she was making undergarments not only for his wife, but for many of the other officers. And she had, quote, an assistant. Now, the assistant could hardly walk, but when we got to the shop, my father says he got beat up really bad by this German who felt that my father fooled him, because when he saw me, he said, "What kind of an assistant is this?" And my father answered him, "Your wife promised my wife that as long as her husband was in charge, we would be safe." I don't know what that meant, but the ghetto was emptied. We lived in the shop with a few other Jewish workers. But then the Germans had to get out of Krakow because I think it's the Russians that were coming in, and they put us all on what they used to call, still do, cattle cars. And we were pushed into this car where my parents said there was no place to lie down. It was so packed, you were literally standing face to face with everyone there, hot, no food, etc. And we ended up in a camp called Gross-Rosen. Now again, I know the name only because my parents told me. In Gross-Rosen, they separated the men and the women. They did not take me away from the line. They let me stay with my mother. My mother decided that she was going to tell the German, again, first I'm an assistant, now I'm going to be a midget. She's going to tell them that I'm a midget and I'm very smart and I will be able to work. This must have been like 43. I would have been around 6. And supposedly I was a midget. And here comes the story where I won my $100. This midget was standing in line with her mother, and suddenly I saw a cat. And I hadn't seen a cat in the longest time. And there was this nice looking cat, according to my mother. And before she could catch my hand, I got down on my hands and knees and started following the cat. And my mother realized, no way is she going to be able to tell this guy I'm a midget. And I'm following the cat. My mother finally got me back into line. And listen, I know he was German. I know he was mean. I know whatever you want to say. But for that moment, that man decided to let me go with my mother. You can say he was kind. You can say he may have been a father. You can be cynical and say, listen, they'll kill her in the next camp. They're not going to let a child go in there. But bottom line is, I went with my mother and we were sent to a work camp. And that was really our saving grace, because a work camp meant that every day the women, it was a women's camp, by the way, every day they would march to a factory that boxed airplane parts. My mother, when she got to that camp, another miracle, she found 7 people that she knew, and 5 of them were from her hometown. She came from a little Polish town. And in those circumstances, I mean, in any circumstances, you go somewhere and you suddenly see a lot of people that you know, you get very excited. And these women helped my mother carry me every day. She couldn't leave me behind in the camp, but she never explained clearly how they let me live. You can't say that they didn't know I was there. They had to know I was there. And I was the only child there. There was a time where I got sick, and to this day, I have no idea what I had. I had red spots all over my legs. Could have been allergy to cold. Okay, back to the story. So we were in this work camp, and then one morning, my mother said it was so quiet when they got up that she realized something was wrong or something was good. Well, the Germans ran away. The Russians came, and she said she was more worried about these rough Russians than the Germans who allowed me to live in the camp. They carried me on their shoulders. They found the child. And they were very excited about it. And that's the end of the story as far as the camps go. My father, on the other hand, in Gross-Rosen, where we were separated, he stayed there a little while. Then he went to a second camp, and then he went to a third camp where he was liberated. I keep saying that I'm alive. Okay, it's a miracle, and my parents were very resourceful. That my father came out alive is again a miracle, because just like he said, he's a tailor. When he was in the third camp, they needed people to work on the railroad line to fix the railroads that the Americans were shooting down at, because they didn't want the Germans to be able to use their railroads. So my father ended up with 2 bullets in his legs. But it was just at the end of the war, literally. Like 2 days later, the war was over in his camp, and he ended up in a hospital, and he lived. Had the war gone on, they would have shot him. You know, what do they need a worker who can't even walk? Now, how did my mother and father find each other? Another crazy story. My father was one of 12, and unfortunately, only 4 survived. There was one sister who really could have been a twin to my father. And the joke was, if she was a man, she would have been very handsome, because my father was very handsome. But for a woman, that was a different story. She really looked like my father, and we used to joke about it. And she was somewhere after the war, everybody was looking for a relative, anybody, find a parent, find a cousin, find someone. And someone walked up to her and said, "Do you have a twin?" And she said, "No, but I look like one of my brothers." So they told her to check out a certain town near where she was, because there's someone in a hospital who looks just like you. And she went, of course, she traveled to wherever it was, and she found my father.
Wow.
I mean, this is the way thousands of people were looking for their relatives all over. Now, I never figured out how my parents found themselves. And my father, again, because he spoke so many languages, he worked for the American government for UNRWA. Where they taught themselves to speak English so well, I don't know. And then the relatives some way found us. There were all kinds of organizations that were putting up lists of different people. And then we had another problem. There was a quota in America. The Polish quota was full, so my father got himself false papers that said he was born in Germany. Now, I'm going to give you the punchline to the whole story. And it's too late to ask or find out why psychologically maybe my parents didn't tell me. Now, I told you my mother made ladies' undergarments. And when you think about the ghetto, the dirt, the people being sick, the people literally lying on the ground. Can you imagine a German or a Polish woman wanting to walk into the ghetto to be fitted by my mother? No, I never thought of that. I mean, she said she used to go out of the ghetto to deliver, but how did they try it on? How did she measure them? So here's the story. Both her parents always said, "We do not want you to go back. Don't give those anti-Semites 5 cents of American money. We don't want you to go and see where you were born, where we lived." So as long as they lived, we listened. But because of Julie's charitable work, we had to go to Warsaw because we thought, and of course it never happened, they were going to start giving something back, because so many Jewish families lost their homes, their factories, their businesses. A lot of countries have given a lot of money back, Germany for sure, but Poland is the worst of all of them. And maybe the reason is that they realize if they start giving back, there's so much there that doesn't belong to them. But we went to Warsaw. I took a private driver who took me to Krakòw because I wanted to see and feel that history. Also, we were able to find in the Washington Museum actual papers with my father's signature. And I have copies of paperwork that shows where we were during the war. Because the Germans, one thing you have to give them, they were very good record keepers. You know, if they had a train going from one town to the other, they could tell you how many people got on and how many people got off because the others died. But the lists were unbelievable. So I have these pieces of paper that say that every 3 months, my father would go to a certain office and would get permission for my mother and myself and my father to live at such and such address. And guess what? The building was not in the ghetto. That's how I survived, because there were so many children that got killed in that ghetto. My mother had a sister who came with us to America because unfortunately she lost her child in the ghetto and her husband was killed in the ghetto. I mean, the Krakòw Ghetto, we know of busloads of children that were taken and killed just out of the ghetto, just like that. And I always used to think how lucky I was that I survived the ghetto. And not only was I at that address, but when I showed this Polish guy the address, he clearly said to me, 2 buildings away, he said, that's where the lower SS lived. He says, you were hidden right under the noses of the Germans. I found that out, it blew my mind, and there's no one to ask. How did she ever get to set herself up outside the ghetto, make these garments for these women, and have the ability to hide a child in her apartment?
Oh my gosh.
I have no idea. That is going to stay a mystery. Did my parents not tell me because they felt guilty that they got something that a lot of people couldn't get?
I remember you saying something about how you lived in a box, but I didn't quite catch which part of the story that happened.
Well, I lived in a box twice, my mother said, but she never told me truthfully or exactly. I'm not going to say she lied, but she never said that the box happened to be in a one-room apartment in a building that was not in the ghetto. She used to say with some customers, she hid me. She said that there were 2 or 3 women that used to come and say, no one's going to stop me. They don't know whose child it is. And they used to take me in a baby carriage on the street, which means right under the nose of the SS. And they brought me extra food because it's unbelievable. At my age, I have all my teeth. Whatever food I missed didn't affect me that much. But none of this is from my memory.
How old were you exactly when you came to America?
9.
And you have zero recollection of the move or anything?
The only memory I have of coming to America was in those days, they brought the people from Europe on old Navy ships and our ship broke. But can you imagine how people go from one ship to another in the middle of the ocean? From then on, I've had a fear of water. What they did is, and that I clearly remember, it was like rope in X's and a wooden thing with wooden steps. And if you look down, you saw the Black Ocean. It was like a bridge to go from one to the other. That's the only European memory I have. And that's not Europe anymore.
Wow. Have you ever spoken to a doctor about your memory loss from before you were?
Oh yeah, to a lot of psychiatrists, sociologists, doctors up and down the line. I wanted someone to hypnotize me so that maybe they could dredge up some memories, and everyone has refused.
Yeah.
They said, you don't want to remember. You're better off not remembering. They keep telling me, no matter what, even if after I found out that I was actually in a one-room apartment and I didn't see all the horrors of the ghetto, I don't know how much time we spent in the ghetto before we got there, how scared I would have been on that cattle car, how scared I would have been being a child that time online when I saw other children disappear right there. It wasn't just one psychiatrist, it wasn't 2. I've spoken to so many people about this. They say, don't touch it. Well, by now, for sure, don't touch it. Probably my memory's gone for good. What's your name again? Because when I was on that line from that cattle car, don't forget, I did not come from the ghetto. I came from that workshop where for a few weeks or months, both my parents worked. And that was also a very important thing in saving my parents' lives because the Germans were looking for workers. If you looked half-starved from a ghetto, they weren't going to send you to a work camp because no matter how mean or how little we got, we still got more food in that workshop than we did if we had just lived under worse circumstances in the ghetto. So I'm not going to say we were well fed, but we looked like someone who could work.
Well, thank you so much for
You're
doing
quite welcome. What time is it? Oh, we almost did an hour. Wow.
all the best wishes to you and Julie. And
Thank you.
that was Dorothy Berman telling her story of her childhood growing up during the Holocaust. For more human stories, you can press the subscribe button below.